We are on Lamed Hey Amud Aleph 35a. We're in the middle of the Gemara's running commentary on the debacle with the spies, last week's Torah portion. And the last comment we made is a play on words, a pun, kind of, in that when the spies come back and say that the people are too strong, mimenu, from us, it can also be read or translated mimenu, from him. And that there's a dual meaning here. First of all, the people in the land of Israel are too strong for us, and also too strong for him, capital H, as if to say, quote, the master cannot remove his own furniture. We discuss what that means.
You're putting yourself in the same category as Hashem.
I don't know if they're doing that so much as saying that they don't think God can do it. And we explained what this means, based on the Rebbe's teaching here, that they acknowledge God as the master, but they mistakenly assume that if God's intention is, this is the mistake they're thinking, if God's intention is that we live within the world of nature, that's the intention. We're leaving the bubble of the desert, where we have manna and clouds of glory and prophecies and revelations and miracles and so on. We're going into the land of Israel, where the commandments are to work the land and trade and commerce with other countries and so on and so forth. They assume, well, if God decided that we should enter nature and be part of nature, then we're subject to the rules of nature. And the rules of nature by God's design is that we can't win. And there's the critical mistake, in that the Jewish people, even as they stand within nature, and externally the Jew looks and behaves like everyone else on the planet, that they are inherently a different people. They're God's people, and even as they walk around in nature, they have that link to that which is beyond, and therefore can overcome whatever challenges there are, even though on the surface of the natural observation of what's happening, it looks insurmountable.
Hadn't they just lived through all the plagues, through the splitting of the Red Sea? They saw that God was above and different and could manipulate nature.
They assume that that's only true so long as we're living in the supernatural world in the desert. But once we enter the natural world, God switches mode, goes to natural mode, and in natural mode we can't overcome. That's what they figured.
So they had no intention, even when they went, they had no intention of saying that this was okay, even before they left.
That's right. The Gemara makes that very clear, that before they even left, they were looking for where they can come back with a negative report. That's correct. Alan says they were spiritually spoiled and didn't want to ruin it, yeah. Right, so they assume that all this miracles and all that stuff only exists when Jews live in a transcendent state. But once Jews go into the natural order, all that's gone. Leave it to nature. And in nature, we can't do it. The reality is they were wrong, because even as the Jews went into the land of Israel, they experienced miracles, even as they were fighting through nature. And
so he picked 10 wrong people.
Sorry?
Moses picked 10 wrong people to go.
We discussed that also earlier, where God kind of trusted Moshe Rabbeinu to make the choice, knowing that there's a high probability of failure, which is, again, is part of the natural order. Meaning, if God's going to let us live in a world of nature and say, figure it out, that means God's assuming that at some point we're going to make mistakes. And
right.
So, okay, but I'm leaving you with the choice anyway, because I want you to figure it out.
Right.
The point is, we should discover that even as we live in this natural order, we're still connected to that which is beyond, and we shouldn't get distracted by the fact that nature says, oh, you can't do it.
Right.
So in that regard, I think we can explain the next passage in the Gemara as well. Even though the Rebbe doesn't discuss it, but it would seem to me that we could use this premise to explain the next passage as well.
That was Moshe's mistake. He
was too trusting, maybe. But,
God said, I'll fight all your wars for you. I'll do everything for you. What else do you want?
Look, you can kind of draw parallels to what the Rebbe did, right? There's a massive risk on a very administrative level with what the Rebbe did. Made thousands of representatives, all of whom can personally speak in his name, And then he told those people, you make you another representative to represent me. Like shliach, shliach, like, okay, you're in charge of that state. Now you hire your own people to represent me. There's a massive risk. Is he interviewing each and every one of these people? We're getting sales training, and if we misrepresent, like the risk of there ever being misrepresented in the world stage is extremely high. And oftentimes mistakes are made, right?
Rebbe is not God.
I know, no, I'm parallel to Moshe Rabbeinu. I'm parallel to Moshe Rabbeinu, right? So, and there's a risk there. And sometimes it happens where someone makes a mistake and says the wrong thing, right? And it's not the individual, shliach's name that gets blemished if he makes a mistake. It's the name of Chabad and the Rebbe. I don't think the Rebbe was foolish enough to think that was never going to happen. He knows he's dealing with human beings that are capable of making mistakes. But he took the risk anyway. And we see the results, right? The positive results far outweigh the negative, right? So I would imagine that process and the risk therein starts at the spies going to the desert. Meaning God says, okay, look, this whole desert thing where I'm carrying you and holding you by the hand and giving you manna, it's done. You guys figure it out. And when you guys figure it out, you send spies, you decide if you want to, you pick who you want. There's going to be the risk of failure. I know that, and I'm okay with that. There might be failures along the way, and there's going to be consequences to failures, and it's going to go back and forth and back and forth. That's fine. But you'll figure it out. And I think that's where it starts with Moshe Rabbeinu, and then there's a failure. But then when Yeshua comes, he doesn't say, oh, I'm not sending spies because it failed by Moshe. He also sends spies. He just does it more correctly, right? So there's almost like a trial and error here that God's almost allowing to play out through Moshe Rabbeinu, through Yeshua, through the leaders and the people. That's the point, that we kind of work it on our own with all the failures that come along with being a human. What do you say?
A few classes back, we discussed this a bit.
Yeah.
And we mentioned that this was before the entrance way into free choice.
That's right. This is the entrance way into free choice. That's right.
Could have forced the Jewish people and said, no, you don't need spies.
That would defeat the purpose.
That would defeat the purpose.
That's right.
Here's where you learn to think positively, think the outcome will be good, make the choice.
Even as you're given the choice,
choice.
know that you rely on God. Even though it's your choice.
Yeah,
It's the same thing as going to business, by the way.
that's the transition.
It's the same thing as going to business. God says, I'm going to provide for you,
Yeah,
but I want you to work. And when you work, I want to see if you trust me or don't trust me.
absolutely.
While you're making your own choices.
That's a great.
It's the same thing here. You're making the choice about going to the land of Israel. You're doing the spies. But when you go, and you're looking for a positive and remembering that I control the world, even though this is a natural order and it's your choice. Right? So that's like the first time the Jewish people encountered this, so to speak, challenge, this dilemma of there's a natural world in which we have to make choices, and at the same time have full reliance on God. That's the first time they met that. And there was, there's the high probability of mistake.
If the child went out, child gets a certain age, and start making a year, start making their own decisions, but they're uncomfortable because
That's right.
it's that transition point.
That's right. And the parents know there's going to be mistakes sometimes, and that's how the kid's going to learn, and it's fine. And they'll deal with it. Okay. So I think with this, we can explain the next Gemara as well. Gemara says like this. The line begins with the word Kalov, Misham, and the third word is Eretz. The verse reads, Eretz Echeles Yeshveahi. The verse reads that the spies came back and said, this is a land that consumes its inhabitants. What does that mean? So Darash Rava explains, Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, God says, Ani, I, Cheshaftia, I thought of this idea that Israel is the land that swallows its inhabitants. Latova, I thought of it as a good thing. Teheim, but the spies, Chashvu, they thought of this idea that the land swallows its inhabitants. Lera, they thought of the same element in the negative. This is something we discussed also earlier, that there's the positive and negative to every trait. And then the choice is, the attitude you have towards that trait, and then your attitude will just determine how it's going to go.
In other words, it's a neutral.
Like most of this universe. Unless God says don't eat that or don't do that, everything else in this universe is basically neutral. What we call in Kabbalah klipas nega.
Kind of goes back to having.
That's right. You have the choice. You decide your attitude, right? In everything, there's positive love and there's negative love. We discussed on Shabbos also, right? Love is a character. Do you use it in a healthy way or do you use it in an unhealthy way? Discipline is a character, healthy way or unhealthy way. So the land swallows its inhabitants, says God. I put it there with the potentiality for good. And that's how I was hoping it'd play out. But they saw it as negative. And therefore they came back with a negative report. Okay, so what's the positive and negative side here? So says the Gemara, I, says God, thought that the land swallows its inhabitants in the positive. Because what I did was, says God, wherever they went, wherever the spies went, the most important of their people, the people who inhabited the land at the time, the Canaanites, their most important leaders died. Why did I do that? And actually do so that the people will be busy burying their dead, burying their leaders and mourning the leaders and trying to replace their leaders. And then they won't have time to be asking about what these spies are doing in this country. Right? That's what God says. I made that wherever they went, they saw the leaders die. And my intention was that the people should look at this and say, oh, look, God's making it work so that we can spy without being noticed. But instead they said, oh my gosh, this land kills all of its leaders. Look at this place. Wherever we go, the leaders are dying. Right? So it would seem to me this plays into the same point we're saying earlier. The natural way of the world is people die. That's the natural way of the world. The natural way of the world are that there's negative things that happen. And then the choice becomes the person observing this. Is this God's hand playing out so that the right thing could come? Or is this, oh my gosh, nature is horrible, people die, we can't go here. We can't deal with it. So it's with everything, that's right. The natural world as it plays out, how do we see it? Do we see this as God's plan, that it works out? Or do we see this as, oh my gosh, this world is horrible, things are falling apart, we can't deal with this, we can't handle this. Let's stay in the desert, right? So God says, look, I manipulated nature in such a way that it would work out for them. But they didn't see it as me manipulating nature. They just looked at it as, oh my gosh, nature is horrible. It swallows up its inhabitants. We can't deal with it. Now, Ikadami, says the Gemara, there's another version to the same point. The first version is that wherever they went, the most prominent leaders died, so that the people are busy mourning the leaders and trying to replace them, so they don't have time to look at the spies. Another version is Iyuv nach nafshe. Iyuv, Job, who lived at this time and lived in Canaan, right? We learned about him way back. That he's one of the people Pharaoh consulted, right? Pharaoh consulted Yisro, Iyuv, and Bilam, right? One, Bilam agreed with him. Yisro protested by leaving. That's why he was rewarded. And Iyuv was silent. And that's why he was condemned to the suffering. But Iyuv, with all the suffering, the book of Job, he's a man of incredible strength and character and faith, notwithstanding his wrestling with God's justice. But nonetheless, he still remains a man loyal to God. And as such, he was like their, this way Rashi puts it, he was like their merit. His being amongst them was their merit. So God organized it that Noch Nafshe, that Iyuv died when they were there. And the entire nation of Canaan is busy mourning the loss of their great merit, Iyuv. So the people, the spies, should have looked at this and said, look at that. As soon as we enter, God manipulates nature in such a way that merit goes to us, not to them. But instead, they thought of it as negative. They said, no, the reason why Iyuv died It's not because God is manipulating nature to make it that the merit is in our favor. The spiritual nature of the world, if you want. They saw it as, oh my gosh, this land is terrible, nature is horrible, it just kills all the leaders. We can't go here.
This could also be the entranceway into Hashem's blessing in a concealed way.
Exactly, Hashem's blessing in a concealed way, that's right. I'll add even further.
The desert was more overt.
The desert's overt blessing, whereas in Israel, that's right. So I'll take it even further. They can look at Eov dying and saying, in the world of nature, merits just die. And the same way their merits die, so can our merits die. Their merits die, Eov dies. That's their merit, is Eov. He dies. They have no merit anymore. Who's saying our merit's not going to die one day? We can't handle this. Without realizing that even when a Jew goes into nature, his merit doesn't die. Even though, the nature is that sometimes some do better and others do worse, and some do better and worse, and nations come up and down, not the Jewish people. But they looked at the Canaan and said, look, their merit's going down, their people are dying. So the same thing's going to happen to us. Because that's the nature of the world. But that's the big mistake. Even as the Jewish people live in nature, we're the living miracle of this. As much as nature says we should have gone the way of every other nation, we're still around. Notwithstanding the fact that we live in a world of nature where we suffered, where we died, where we hurt, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the core day, we're still here. This is really, even before you even get to the spiritual level of the curses and the curses in the Torah, before you even get to the spiritual meaning, how the blessings are really curses, just the plain direct translation. The verse goes on to describe incredible atrocities and curses that will befall the Jewish people. And at the end, it concludes that God will never hate you to the point that he will abandon you. Even after all of the catastrophe of the curses because we failed to live up. Right? So when it comes to Canaan, when their merit's done, their merit's done. So the spies think, okay, well, one day our merits will be done because that's the nature of the world. But that's the mistake. Even as the Jews are, quote, down, their merit never ends. They're still the Jewish people, and we're still here. Very powerful message.
With all that transpired, after God promising Israel is good and this and that, they should have interpreted it saying, look, he's killing them all off for us.
That's what they should have interpreted, yeah.
You know?
But like you said, they were spoiled, right? Yes, you're right, they should have. Okay, a few more lines in the Gemara. So the verse reads, "V'nehi beinenu kechagavim." The verse describes the spies' report. They said, we were in their eyes. No, sorry, we were in our own eyes, comparing ourselves to the people like grasshoppers. And so were we in their eyes. So they said two things. When we looked at ourselves compared to these massive people, we seemed like grasshoppers, and they viewed us as grasshoppers.
That's interesting because how they know how they perceive.
That's precisely the Gemara's question. Amar Mashashir says, Meragim the spies, Shakri Havam. They were liars. Bishlema, all is well, that we saw ourselves as grasshoppers. That makes sense. That's fine. That's their own perception. Very good. But we seemed in their eyes as spies. How are they supposed to know that?
They didn't speak to them. There's no conversation.
That's right. So how are they supposed to know? Which already is a good lesson. Which is a very good lesson. You can see yourself as humble. Internally, you should see yourself humble as a grasshopper. But when you're on God's mission, don't go on to that they see you as grasshoppers. No, they don't. They see you as God's people. You look at yourself as a grasshopper, so to speak. You look at yourself and say, who am I? I'm humble. I'm a nobody. But the way other people see me, I'm God. This is God's Jewish people. Don't play humility in the wrong. Don't play humility in their eyes. Play humility in your own eyes, not in someone else's eyes. It's almost as if the Gemara is saying they were right to see themselves as grasshoppers. But don't assume that that's the way everybody sees you. The way they see you is as God's people. And you behave that way, even if internally you look at yourself and say, I'm a grasshopper, I'm nobody. That in of itself is a very serious lesson. Sorry?
Just that one line.
Each of these things can be a whole farbrengen. Yes. But the Gemara makes another comment and says Velohi, but it's not true. They weren't liars. Because ki have a mavara avele. I have to make sure I translate this right because this is Aramaic. We described earlier that the people lost their leaders. They lost the youth. So the custom was and is that after coming back from the burial, you have a meal called subas havara. It's like that comforting meal we have today. We eat egg, whatever. So the people in Canaan were going to eat that meal, that post-funeral meal, the mourner's meal. So tuti arze havamavare. They sat under cedar trees to eat that meal. And when they saw the people sitting down in front of the cedar trees to eat their mourner's meal, they were afraid of being noticed. So salku yasvi beilane. They climbed up and sat on those cedar trees to observe from far. And shame, they overheard the people sitting eating their meal. They said, I saw some people that looked like grasshoppers in the tree. So it wasn't the lie that the other people saw them as grasshoppers because they overheard it. Now, at the end of the Gemara. Now here's my commentary on this to keep in line with our thinking. When did the spies say that they look like grasshoppers? Not when we were on the ground, but when they climbed up to the tree. Meaning, I think this is what it means. When they displayed themselves as afraid, then they said, these guys are grasshoppers. They don't really represent God. They're grasshoppers, they're nobodies. As soon as they displayed fear, as soon as they lacked their Jewish pride, then the others say, just they're nobody. Because only once they climbed up the tree, because they were afraid, that's when they were observed to be like grasshoppers. So they weren't lying. But the fact that they were seen as grasshoppers is also because they didn't present themselves with the kind of Jewish pride that says, internally I'm a grasshopper, but I represent Hashem.
It's not only how others don't allow others to perceive you as such in your mind, but also in how you behave.
That's right. It's correct.
Like,
So internally,
don't show it,
that's right.
Don't think it.
So internally, I look at myself and say, who am I?
Right.
Nobody. But I'm God's Jew. And as God's Jew, I behave that way.
Yeah.
I'm proud of being God's Jew. But as soon as I climb up to the trees to hide, then they look at you and say, you're. I was actually just reading this. I was listening to a historian just yesterday. And he's making this observation about the uniqueness of anti-Semitism. The uniqueness of anti-Semitism amongst all the various different racial issues. And he was saying how the Jews are the only group of people that are hated for, right? So he's defining what racism is. Racism is to look at another group and think of them as either inferior, which is the more common version of racism, to think of another race as inferior, or to look at another race as superior. And he said that's where the Jews have this unique version of racism, of anti-Semitism, where Jews are seen problematic when they're inferior or as superior. Like if they're, if they assimilate, oh my gosh, look at those Jews, they're assimilating too much. If they don't assimilate, why are the Jews sticking to themselves? So it's whether we're inferior or superior, this is anti-Semitism. So I think maybe this is what's happening here. They retreat to behave like grasshoppers and present themselves as grasshoppers, then they're looked at, they're perceived as that way. Said, look at those little grasshoppers, they're nobodies.
We control the world and we're an inferior race at the same time.
Exactly. That's right. That's right. So that's right. That's right. So even though it's true that internally we look at ourselves and say, who are we? We're nobody. We earned God to choose us. We didn't earn nothing. But because God did choose us, we're proud of who we are and we stand tall. We're not going to climb up to the trees and have people call us grasshoppers. That's not happening. Anyway, lots to be fabricating about.
And we don't think that they will think we are grasshoppers.
Sorry.
We won't think
That's right. We're not going to think
we're
that. That's
grasshoppers
correct.
As well as.
That's right.
Acting
That's right.
as grasshoppers.
Well, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy where they think to themselves that, oh my gosh, they must look at us as nobodies. So therefore we act like nobodies. And then they indeed look at us and say, you're a nobody. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, you have a wonderful day. And God willing, tomorrow, more commentary on the few more comments on the story of the spies. Have a wonderful day.
Write a book just in this place.
Just almost 2 lines.